Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I'm Jennifer Hargrove, a senior planner with SACOG. Today I'll be the moderator for this webinar. All of you as participants are muted throughout the webinar, but we will welcome questions. Just please use the chat box for those and I will relay them to our speakers. We'll probably do all the questions at the end of the webinar, but feel free to type them in throughout. We have two speakers today. First up, to help set the stage, is Dov Caden from SACOG. Dov is going to briefly talk about SACOG's housing policy toolkit that he took the lead on developing for our region in late 2018. We want to give you all a quick reminder about that toolkit, and then we'll focus in on some of the best practices from the zoning section for our session today. After hearing from Dov, he'll hand it over to Alex Steinberger from Cascadia Partners, who is our main presenter today. Alex is part of the consulting team that SACOG and Sacramento Regional Transit are using for our regional TOD action plan. That project is coming to completion very soon, but Alex was very instrumental in the economic, zoning, and policy analysis that was done for that project. That's actually what brings him here today. The grant is funding some limited technical assistance with Alex and some members of our TOD plan advisory group. However, knowing that all of you are gearing up for housing elements and potential zoning code changes now, we asked if he would be willing to share some of his insights and analysis and tools with us today. I'm going to give a bit more of an intro for Alex. That way Dov can just hand it straight over to Alex and we can keep the presentation flowing. Alex is an urban planner and economist with a strong foundation in geographic information systems, or GIS. His experience in scenario planning and transit-orient development allows him to fulfill a broad range of project needs, from urban design to redevelopment analysis. His work focuses on corridor analysis, housing, and economic development. He has experience working at a range of scales, from site-specific redevelopment projects to regional visioning efforts. In every project, Alex employs cutting-edge planning tools and techniques with an eye for communicating complex topics to non-technical audiences. His experience has taught him that the technical analysis is only as useful as the story as it is able to tell. So for now, I'll turn it over to Dov to get started on the housing policy toolkit, and then we'll hear from Alex.
All right, thanks, Jen. And hopefully you can see my screen there. All right, good morning, everyone. Before I turn it over to Alex, we wanted to start this conversation by talking about the SACOG Housing Policy Toolkit, which we released about 1.5 years ago now. And guiding this work is a recognition that we face a variety of challenges to building housing, and more infill housing in particular. So some of those challenges are in the direct control of local governments, and some are not. Cities and counties are somewhat limited in their ability, as we all know, to sort of impact more of the structural issues like construction costs or market forces. What local governments do have direct control over is the regulatory framework by which we are planning for and approving housing. And that's everything on the right side. So that's what we focused in on the toolkit. I think sometimes the challenges on the left can feel somewhat daunting, but there really is still value in pursuing the policy changes that are within our local control. And illustrating that point, you may recall that last year we had David Garcia from the UC Berkeley Turner Center come out and do a return on cost analysis of a hypothetical suburban apartment building in the Sacramento region. And so he came out and spoke to the housing planners group, as well as to the SACOG board and the Civic Lab teams. And it was a pro forma based on a suburban SACOG rents and cost situation. And one of the interesting takeaways from that was the project did not pencil at first, but under existing conditions, but by layering a series of policy changes that are within local control, the project did become feasible. So the housing policy toolkit itself divides the many different policy recommendations into 4 categories. We have zoning, ADU ordinances, development review processes, and fees. Almost every single SACOG jurisdiction is currently pursuing one of these toolkit policies through the SB2 planning grants. And hopefully we'll have a lot more through LEAP and then through REAP. But nobody, as far as I know, has done everything. So there's always more work to do. I'm just going to highlight a couple of the policies from these categories that we have really been focusing in on recently. I'll skip the ADU section because we'd like to have a little bit more of an in-depth discussion on ADUs at a later date. But starting with development review processes, so the primary policy we wanted to highlight here is to move more from a highly discretionary process like the one on the left towards more of a ministerial or a by right process like the one on the right. And as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, a by right process is one in which you set up the objective standards and the rules up front. And then if a housing project comes forward that plays within those rules, it would be approved at the staff level. There would be, it would not need to go to some sort of discretionary decision-making body for a yes/no vote, like a planning commission, city council, board of supervisors. So the surface level benefit of this type of process is that it can significantly reduce the time and the uncertainty of getting a project approved. You have less risk of a couple vocal neighbors having perhaps a disproportionate influence at a city council meeting on a project that may have community-wide benefits. There's another benefit though, and it has to do with CEQA, which we often talk about as one of those state regulations that can really be a barrier. And importantly, CEQA only applies to projects that are approved through a discretionary process. So by approving the projects at the staff level, which is something that local governments have the ability to do and control themselves, you're both relieving the burden of providing a CEQA document, and you're eliminating much of the litigation risk down the road, because the CEQA document is the legal standing upon which usually a project is litigated. So this is also, I think, a particularly important policy change to be thinking about right now at a time when our typical processes are taking a little bit longer than usual. Lenders are especially weary of delays. So I think a timely policy to think about. The second category is fees. And one of the biggest ways that fee structures can discourage multifamily and more affordable housing types is charging fees by the number of units. And under this system, the 2 units on the screen are charged the exact same fee, which means that a developer is in some ways incentivized to build as large a unit as the market will bear to get their money's worth. Structuring fees instead based on something like square footage can encourage denser projects with smaller unit sizes, which actually tend to have less of an impact and can make more efficient use of the infrastructure as well. So the last category is zoning, which is the main topic for today. And I think it's sometimes easy to just think of zoning as what is the max units per acre that the zone allows. And certainly that can be a barrier. The sixplex that you see on the screen is no skyscraper by any means, but it's actually over 50 units an acre. And that's greater than the maximum allowed in almost all of our region. In fact, over 95% of residential land in our region doesn't allow for over 30 units an acre. So sort of the top level recommendation is of course to look at those maximum units per acres and perhaps relax them. It's certainly what HCD is going to be looking for as a part of housing elements. But there's also other aspects of zoning that can be a barrier to these products. You can see that for this sixplex, the building needs basically the whole lot to actually fit the 6 units on a parcel this small. So again, 54 units an acre, but 4-foot setbacks, uses about 85% of the lot, 0 parking spaces. And as soon as you introduce some fairly common requirements like a 50% lot coverage maximum, or 20-foot setback minimums on either side, or requiring 2 parking spaces per unit, that sixplex becomes physically impossible to build regardless of what density is actually allowed in the zone. And when you apply all 3, you barely have room for a single family home. So sometimes it's these hidden barriers in our zoning codes that are actually driving both the density of the project that ultimately gets built, as well as the financial feasibility of building this type of housing. And that, I think, is a good segue to turn it over to Alex. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and Alex is going to dig a little bit deeper into these hidden barriers within our zoning codes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Steinberger. I'm a managing partner with Cascadia Partners. We're based up in Portland, Oregon, but we do quite a bit of work in your region. And I actually grew up in Davis, so I know your region better than most folks up here in Oregon. A bit about Cascadia Partners. We work all over the country in communities that range from large cities to small towns, looking at their codes and trying to find issues and also get them all the way through adoption of their codes. We recognize that everything that's gone into a zoning code that may now not apply at one point made some sense, but over time, and because of overlapping regulations and other considerations that weren't made, these things have become stupid. And so we like to say we get the stupid out of zoning, even if every standard had some rationale that was based in good sound logic when it was adopted. And the reason we think we're uniquely qualified to do this is because we're both planners and developers. We have folks on our staff who have built missing middle housing, who've done public-private partnerships. So we understand from a developer's perspective how interactions with zoning and policy can hinder projects from getting built. And we also have a solid track record of getting projects implemented. As Jennifer mentioned in my bio, we have a very strong focus on communicating complex topics for a broad audience. And we understand that these zoning changes that you or I may understand are good and make sense, need a significant amount of political massaging to get through the process. So we know how to get that done, and we've done that in many communities, particularly across the West. So I think everyone's in a bit of a kind of apocalyptic mood these days. And so I figured today we could focus on the 4 horsemen of the zoning apocalypse. I call these gentlemen setbacks, density, parking, and complexity. And what we'll do here today is go through these as categories and point out some examples from our experience and suggest some best practices. This is not an exhaustive list. There are actually more than 4 horsemen of the zoning apocalypse if you really think about it. But for today, we thought this would be a pretty good starting point. So let's start with setbacks. Setbacks, like I said earlier, like every standard, they're rooted in good intentions. You know, we want to create air and space between buildings. We want to create green space for folks to recreate in and enjoy. But often what we envision with setbacks is actually not what we get. We end up with landscape space that takes up precious water, that isn't particularly usable and isn't particularly nice to look at, and creates a non-pedestrian friendly urban environment. And sometimes those examples get really extreme. This example is from the city of Milwaukee, Oregon, which is a kind of a first-ring suburb around Portland. And they asked us to look at their cottage cluster ordinance. And what they were realizing was that no one was taking advantage of this zone. And they asked us to look at why. And the first thing we hit on is that at a very typical 6,000 square foot lot size, you can only build 4 cottages. And not only that, you can't even build the living portion of the cottages. All you can build are the front porches. So you can hang out on your front porch all day, but when the sun goes down, you'll have nowhere to go. And that's because of all of the setbacks in this zone. They had lot setbacks, setbacks for individual buildings, and no one had ever considered these holistically or done any sort of physical modeling to see if they would actually be possible to build. This is an egregious example. A lot of times things aren't quite as obvious. This is actually an example from your region. And here we see relatively large front and rear setbacks and side setbacks, 25 feet in the front, 15 on the side and in the rear. And in this zone, the maximum density is 14 units per acre. And the only way you hit that here with the constraints that the setbacks create is through relatively small units. Now that may work, but in most markets, that's going to be difficult to sell, especially if you're trying to do a for sale duplex project. But if we reduce those setbacks to a more urban standard, like 5 feet in the front and 5 feet on the side, now we can create larger, more marketable duplex units that are actually feasible. So right here, just by changing that one standard in our code from large setbacks to smaller ones, we can change the feasibility equation in this zone. So setback best practices, focus open space requirements on creating usable space, like shared courtyards, rather than just setback from the street. Consider upper floor step backs rather than setbacks where appropriate. If you are just stepping back on upper floors, that's a lot less loss of building volume. Reduce front setbacks to encourage more pedestrian-friendly urban form, bring the buildings up to the street, and allow parking in the setback. And you'll hear me say this last one quite a bit today, but it's really key to perform these massing studies on your zones so you avoid the front porch scenario that the city of Milwaukee was experiencing. That's key, and it's amazing how many communities just don't do that. So now to the second horseman of the zoning apocalypse, density. Density is a direct impact on urban form and affordability. And in almost every community we work, missing middle housing is pretty uniformly liked. This is from a visual preference survey we did in Laramie, Wyoming. And the types of housing that people preferred most were the ones that their current code made hardest to build. This is not unique to Laramie. This happens all over the country. And if you look at one of their zones today, it only allows 3 units per lot for a lot this size in this example. And based on that, you would assume that a developer is going to build the maximum sized unit that they can build because they're trying to maximize their return. So the most feasible thing is to build relatively large units that sell for almost $400,000 a unit. And that's really only affordable to sort of the upper echelon of earners in this example in Laramie, Wyoming, which are the physicians and the associate professors. But if we relax the minimum lot area required per unit and allow 5 units, you get smaller, much more affordable units that open up an ownership housing product to a broader range of incomes. So you can see we went from 108% of AMI required to afford these units to just 72% of AMI. Another thing I want to highlight, and this is something we see in a lot of communities, is the mismatch between minimum lot area per unit and the typical lot sizes in a community. Every community has a typical lot pattern, and you can use GIS to figure out what that is. In this instance here, this is from Lander, Wyoming. We can see that the typical lot size based on the lots in a given zone is between 6,500 and 7,500 square feet. So if you measure that against the minimum lot area required to build a house, you can see that if I'm trying to build a single family house, which requires 6,000 square feet, and I have one typical lot, I'm in pretty good shape. I have enough to build a single family house plus a little bit more. But if I want to build a duplex, it starts to get tricky, because if I try to use one lot, I don't have enough space. But if I have 2 contiguous lots that I can assemble, Now I'm wasting land. I can only build 2 units when I clearly have enough space to do more. Similarly, with a fourplex, I need 16,500 square feet, which is equivalent to 2 and some change typical lots. So it's really not a situation that makes it easy to assemble land efficiently and build more units. And then there's the other issue of, do we even need this much land realistically to build a fourplex or a duplex? We looked at typical fourplex configurations for older missing middle housing from the 40s and 50s in this town in Wyoming, and found that if you take the same footprint that they are on and plop that down onto the minimum lot size, it's way out of whack with how much land you realistically would want to build something like this. In this example, taking an existing fourplex and putting it on the minimum lot size, you have about 1/3 of an acre of yard area and only 12% lot coverage. So it's a really inefficient way to use land, and it's not very encouraging for infill. And because you can map all this stuff and pull the numbers in GIS, you can figure out exactly how much of your existing lots allow different types of unit development within a zone. So in this example, we found that almost 1/3 of lots are non-conforming based on their current standards. And in addition, less than 15% allow more than a single family home. And of course, you can map that and figure out where in the city is this issue most present and try to adjust for that. But this is key, and so many communities don't do this. But it's a really important way to ensure that the standards that you're putting into your code reflect reality and don't create a division between intent and what can actually be built. So density best practices, there's no single number, obviously, for density. It should be context sensitive. But like I said, performing a lot size analysis and trying to understand what is the typical lot pattern and how does that relate to lot area per unit or per building. And also, this is a big one, and we're going to talk about it more in a second, but consider the impact of parking. That is so important. Parking is probably the biggest thing, the biggest hidden barrier in our codes that pulls us further away from the intent of a zone. Some communities we work in, the parking requirements haven't been updated in years, and some of them just defy logic. Like this one from another small town in Western Colorado, for some reason requires more parking if you have dancing at a bar or a restaurant. I'm not sure why that would induce more driving and need for parking, but there it is. And they require 20 spaces per 1,000 square feet. That's crazy. That is so much parking. And this, again, is an egregious example, but parking can often stand in the way of desired outcomes and also hurt feasibility. And what we find pretty consistently is that the types of development that people seem to like the most, they're the ones with no parking. This is newer retail development in Bend, Oregon, and also, closer to your region here in Midtown. The reason why people like this district is the funky mix of different uses. And these that we see here wouldn't be possible without zero parking at the time that they were built. And there's a huge impact on urban form, and that's pretty obvious. This is an example from Portland when they were considering updating some of their residential and mixed use zones. And what they found doing the same kind of analysis that we often do is that on a typical 10,000 square foot lot, if you require 0 spaces per residential unit, the most profitable thing for a developer to build is 32 condos. But if you require 1.5 spaces per unit, the most profitable thing for a developer to build is 10 much larger townhomes. So why is that? Well, with the condos, if you don't require any parking spaces, obviously your parking cost is 0, and you can sell those off at a relatively low $280,000 per unit, which is well below area median income in Portland. But if you require 1.5 spaces per unit, As we saw in Dov's example of the sixplex, there's nowhere to put that parking except underground. And if I have to put that parking underground, that's $2.1 million in extra cost added to this project, which adds about $70,000 to the purchase price of each unit, rendering the whole project infeasible because no one wants to pay that much for small condos. Now, if we did the same thing, if we apply the same parking ratio to the townhomes, you end up with larger townhomes and a sales price that is actually achievable at $720,000 per unit because these units are much larger. But as a result, less housing and housing that's really not affordable to a broad spectrum of folks. So it's not really the outcome that they intended. And as a result of this analysis, they ended up going with a lower parking standard. Here's another way to look at that. This is from an example in Bend, Oregon, where the median household income is $52,000. And oftentimes when parking standards are implemented, the vision is for an outcome like this, with this 4-story building, where all of the parking is underground. But as many of us know, that rarely pencils. You need really high rents to make that work. And so in this example, at $45,000 a space, our building is really only affordable to those making $82,000 a year, which is more than 50% above where we should be. Now, if I'm a cost-conscious developer, I'll probably try to build this I'll probably accommodate the parking in a surface parking lot. It's much cheaper, but you end up with a building that's pretty suboptimal. Not a lot of people would choose to build something like this, and it still requires a household income that is higher than the median. But if we reduce the parking to 3/4 of a space per unit, we can accommodate it in a mix of surface and tuck under parking and have a much more feasible result. And actually, we're able to rent these out at a level that's affordable to people making the median income. So this shows how parking interplays with both urban form and affordability. So best practices for parking. Again, this is really context sensitive, but set parking minimums low. We like to let the market decide. And I always tell people that in Portland, we had 0 parking required on the books for almost 3 decades before anyone took advantage of it. So even if you set your parking to 0, developers can still choose whether or not they want to provide parking at that level. But at least it gives them more flexibility to meet demand and to potentially build that 4-story building. If you have to set a parking requirement that's not 0, make sure that whatever your maximum density is allowed in the zone can be built with the parking required without building underground parking. Because as many of you know, I'm sure, most areas of your region, underground parking is not going to pencil. So if that's the way that if that's the only way to accommodate parking, it's just going to keep projects from happening. Another best practice that many cities in your region have already done is to waive parking requirements within a certain distance of high capacity transit, for instance, within high quality transit areas. And finally, allow on-street parking to count against off-street requirements. It's a small thing, but it can be helpful if those on-street spaces can reduce your parking requirements. So our last horseman of the zoning apocalypse is complexity. And we see this in a lot of communities. It is hard to see it happening in real time, but with many zones, you can see these things if you look back over many years. And what we're looking at here that kind of looks like an eye chart that you might see at your optometrist is actually a list of all the unique zone, overlay, and combining district combinations in the city of Austin, Texas's zoning code. And this is just crazy. I mean, we found that there are over 400 unique zone combinations. It just makes your head spin. And the reason why this happened is their code was last updated the year that I was born. So it's been over 3 decades since they've touched their code in a meaningful way. And though they have 31 base zone districts, which is quite a lot, the additional layers of neighborhood plans, compatibility standards, combining districts have created this alphabet soup of code that requires a PhD to understand. And this, like I said, it didn't happen overnight. The reason these things happen is that political needs and individual stakeholder needs influence what goes into the code incrementally. And over time, those layered requirements create complexity. And individual additions or amendments that were made were never considered as part of the whole code. And their impacts on other zones and other building types were never considered. So, I'm sure we could find this in everybody's code, and I'm sure everyone has their own individual horror story about this, but it's all too common and it's totally avoidable. So how do we mitigate complexity in our codes? Well, the goal should always be to have a code that provides clear and objective standards. The average homeowner should be able to easily understand the code. That's the goal. It's difficult to achieve that, but that's definitely the target. Always consider the impact of code amendments holistically. Small changes may have impacts on other sections of the code or may have other unintended consequences. And finally, audit your code every 10 years. And that's a minimum. Take a deep, holistic, comprehensive look at your code. Do this, pro forma and physical modeling of your code just to make sure that everything still works. And you are sure to keep the stupid out of your code. It's work, but it's necessary because too many codes across the country suffer from these issues. So do a little time check here. Great. So I wanted to share a little bit of our approach to code audits and then take some questions from you all. One of the things that we're hoping to leave you with is a pro forma based zoning audit tool and a step-by-step guide that will hopefully allow you to do this kind of work in your communities. We know with SB2 and all of these other efforts that are happening to increase housing production across California, this kind of work is critical. So to the extent that these tools can be useful to you, we want to make them available. And so I want to do a little demo here of our pro forma tool so you get a sense of how it works. So hopefully y'all can see this. But yeah, so this is our pro forma tool. And it's an Excel spreadsheet based tool. So you don't need any fancy software to use it. It's just Excel. And the way we set it up is to actually have you plug in your existing code standards and then create a building within them. So we ask for information like setbacks, maximum height, maximum FAR and units per acre. These are typical zone standards. We have others that we use for some other projects, such as lot dimensions and lot coverage requirements. These are pretty typical as well. And in addition to modeling an existing standard, you can also choose to tweak that standard by changing some of these requirements and measuring those instead. And you'll see what that's like in a minute. So this is what the pro forma tool looks like. And I apologize if it's a bit small. But up here, we have a readout of site area. And you can see the red is our building footprint and the green is our landscaping and setback area. And the pro forma, it takes real estate pro formas in a little bit of a different direction in that it's geared towards a planner and the way a planner thinks. So instead of plugging in the number of units or the number of parking spaces, it tells you the number of units that would be contained within your building the density of jobs and housing units, and also, very importantly, the rate of return on your building. So in this instance, I've created a building that looks more or less like this. And this is SketchUp, which many of you may be familiar with. It's a 3D modeling tool. And this building that we're seeing here was actually created automatically by a linkage between the spreadsheet and the SketchUp program. So you can see if I were to increase my building height from 4 stories to, let's say, 8 stories, it will build me my building. But it also looks at setbacks, landscaping, and balances the area needed for both a building and its associated parking. So back to the pro forma. In this example, we have a 4-story building. We have 35 units on our site, and the site's about a ½ acre. And so we're coming in at about 79 units per acre. Now, this is a zone that actually exists in your region. I won't say exactly where, but it allows 80 units per acre. It allows 2.5 maximum FAR, and it allows both residential and commercial. And so right now, the building, if we go back to our model, just refresh this, it looks pretty okay. You know, it's taking up the most of the lot. There's not a big surface parking lot. It's a nice urban building. It's hitting our maximum density required, which is great. And it includes both commercial and residential. So it's basically, it's the planner's dream, right? We have relatively dense mixed-use development. This would be great in a high quality transit area. However, there's one major issue with this building, and that is its financial performance. Right now, the cash on cash return is negative, and the internal rate of return is less than 2%. We really want this to be around 10%. And so why might that be the case? Well, in this zone, the requirement for parking for residential units is around 2.5 spaces per unit. And the requirement for retail is 3.6 spaces per 1,000 square feet of retail. And so if you remember from this image, there's no parking, right? But that's because we've accommodated it in 3 levels of underground parking. That's a lot of parking, and recall that the cost per space is about $45,000 per space. So by having to provide all that parking and putting it underground, we've torpedoed the feasibility of this project. So what happens if I get rid of that underground parking? Well, I can move this slider, and you can see my return is now up at 8%, which is great. But now all the parking that I have for my building is on the surface. So if we go back to our model, we can see, wow, that's not a very inspiring building. It's kind of a little tower. It looks kind of funky. I doubt anyone would want to build this, let alone live in it. And it doesn't really contribute a lot to the urban environment here. So we've improved our return, but the outcome isn't really feasible from a building perspective. So what if we reduce our required parking? Well, let's try half a space per unit and 1 space per 1,000 square feet of retail. You can see these cells have turned red, and that's because when we plugged in our standards, we told it how much parking we needed, and it's telling us, hey, you're not providing enough parking per your standard. So it gives you that feedback. But nonetheless, we can plug that in, and now our return is pretty good, and our building is looking a bit better. It's using up about half the site. Maybe we can do a bit more, so we can try adding a little bit of tuck under parking, about half the level of that. Now we're at 10% return. Wow, right on the money. It's like I planned this or something. 10% return, 55 units an acre. And if we go back to our model, looks pretty good. has a little bit of surface parking, a little bit of tuck under, takes advantage of the lot, provides a nice urban building, and it pencils. So parking really was the key here. And if we wanted to test alternative standards, we could go back to the zone matrix and we could plug in different numbers here and test if we break the code. I'll also mention that we have control here over the financial attributes of the building as well. Construction costs, land costs, things like impact fees and taxes, we can test those things. And then we can also test different rents and see, how low could we get this rent to go while still keeping the building financially feasible. You can also program in affordable or below market units as well. So there's a lot more you can do. We barely scratched the surface with this, but hopefully this is interesting and something you'd like to use more. We have a PowerPoint presentation that we'll provide to everyone that includes a step-by-step guide, basically walks you through what I just did. And so hopefully that gives you enough to get started. Before we go to questions, I just wanted to highlight one additional attribute of what we're able to do with these types of tools. And that is scaling up the type of analysis we just did to measure broader policy impacts of changes to zoning. So for instance, if I reduce parking in a zone, I make certain building types more feasible, and I actually change where they can be built. I'm changing that equation for a developer. And so a lot of times what we'll do is called a residual land value analysis using these tools. Residual land value is this concept in real estate economics that tries to back into the maximum amount a developer could afford to pay for a piece of land. So if I'm increasing the residual land value of a building, I'm changing the number of places where it can be built and potentially increasing the capacity of my zoning. In this example here, you can see two identical townhome products, but for reduced parking in one. And the reduced parking example, as rents go up, it can achieve more and more land value. It can be built on more and more expensive land. Another way to look at that is across a range of different building types that are possible within a zone. In this example with current code standards for parking, you can see that some of these buildings couldn't be built even if land was free. So those buildings that are below the zero line that have the red negative numbers, those are hopeless currently. But others could be built given land was sufficiently cheap. In some cases, land could be as much as $42 a foot and a building with pencil. But if I make one change, just one small parking change to the code, it completely changes the equation for these buildings. And now almost all of them are feasible at some land cost, and some of them can accommodate quite a bit of land cost. So they could be built almost anywhere. And using a tool called Envision Tomorrow, which is actually used in your region by SACOG and others, you can map out where these properties might exist. So if I wanted to know under current code what parcels are likely to redevelop and how many units would redevelop, I can do that. But you can also say, test an alternative. If you reduced your parking ratios, how many more parcels does that open up? How many different newer building types does that allow? And what's the impact to your zoned capacity? And there's a lot more that this tool can measure, such as housing costs and tax revenue potential. A lot there. And there's a resource online, envisiontomorrow.org, where you can learn more about how this tool is used. And also you have a great resource there in your region with SACOG. So as I mentioned, all of these tools that we've shown you today are free and open source. Envisiontomorrow.org is where you can learn about the tool we just were showing you. And through Jennifer, we'll provide you with the pro forma spreadsheet we were just using, as well as a step-by-step set of instructions so that you can do your own code auditing with these tools. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. It looks like we've got about 15 minutes for those.
Great. Thank you, Alex. We do have a few questions going already, starting with your most recent, where you were looking at the tool. There was a question about the typical internal rate of return and cash return rates that a developer would want to see. I think you addressed that. You said around 10% is where most developers are going to want to see that. Is that right?
It's really dependent on product type. So if I'm doing commercial development and I'm doing for rent or retail or office type of construction, you want to be somewhere between 9 and 12%. And that's for market rate projects. If I'm a nonprofit developer, I typically am more patient and am willing to accept a lower rate of return. That could be down in the 5 to 8%. If it's for sale, like condos or single family homes or attached housing, you have a different metric that you look at, but typically you want to be a little bit higher, especially for smaller projects, somewhere between 10 and 15%. If it's a large subdivision, you're willing to accept a smaller return because you're doing that development in volume, essentially.
Okay, thanks. And then there's a question about in our region, typically outside of downtown Sacramento, we typically don't see underground parking done. Do you have a sense of the cost difference between structured parking and underground parking?
Yeah, we assume $20,000 a space for structured parking versus 45 for underground for your region.
Thanks. Oh, I just lost my question. And then anyone else on the call, please send any questions now. We only have a couple more left. So I'll give you a few minutes to type any in. There was a question about in the setback comparison that you did, Alex, I think earlier in the first of the 4 Horsemen comparisons that you were looking at. There's a question about the lot coverage not appearing to change that much in the examples. Was that the only thing that changed to make it feasible, or was there other changes in unit size? Yeah.
Yeah, so the unit size is the primary driver here. What the setbacks in this example do is they limit you to really just a very small portion of your lot being developable, which in some cases may work, but if you need to have a 6,200 square foot lot and all you can build is 2 800 square foot attached or stacked townhomes, it's not particularly profitable for a developer. But if you relax the setbacks, you could potentially build larger units that are more profitable. And in this analysis, we actually went further beyond setbacks to suggest that, yes, do that, but also increase the number of units that you could build within this zone. Because where it really starts to kick off is if you can do a 4-plex. And if you can do a 4-plex, you can do smaller, more affordable units and still have the project pencil.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions come in. I'm going to give just another minute to see if there's any last questions. And thank you to everybody who has already sent some in. A few more questions did come in. Can you say a few words about FAR versus height limits?
I assume that question is with regard to which one's a better practice for regulating density. And the person who asked it can respond if I have that wrong. But I think what we see in a lot of communities that becomes problematic is when you have multiple governors of density. And if it's FAR versus height, I don't know that I have a particularly strong inclination one versus the other. But when you have FAR and units per acre, things can start to get a bit problematic when those things don't quite agree. So, I would recommend just having an FAR standard and not a density cap. That allows more flexibility for smaller units potentially, or for other uses. height is a very difficult, it's very difficult to gauge the outcome of a height limit by itself. You could have some pretty undesirable outcomes from that. FAR probably gives you a bit more nuance. And it's pretty rare in many communities that height limits actually are attainable given the density standards or the parking requirements. One other thing I'll say about height limits, especially when you get into more urban construction, is that there are major jumps in construction costs at a certain number of floors. So when you go from stick construction to steel construction, you see a large jump in the construction cost per foot. And often when you see like a density bonus that gets you from, let's say, 6 stories to 8 stories, it's not going to be particularly effective, because at 6 stories, you can probably still do a stick-built over podium building. But as soon as you get to 7 or 8, you're in steel. And so it's not a great incentive for someone to want to build those 2 additional floors, because it trips them into a whole new type of construction. So rather, be aware of where those transition points are. And if you're giving an incentive, make sure that a lot more floors are possible if someone is going to have to up their construction type and pay more per square foot.
Great. I think that's probably all the questions we have time for. I want to make sure we end on time. I want to say thank you so much again to Alex for joining us today. This has been very helpful.